tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We know that Canada has committed itself, as have many countries around the world, to this idea of net zero, which means we are supposedly going to get down to net zero in our carbon emissions by, the number keeps changing, 2035, 2030. I think it's supposed to be next week or something. If you give them enough time, they just keep moving it closer and closer. And the way we get there is always the key. It's one thing to just set a target and set a date on a calendar and say net zero by X time on X day of X year. It's another thing when you talk about what that actually means on the ground. And we see no shortage of quite radical proposals put forward in the name of achieving net zero. And most of them end up coming down to that idea of a just transition, of just transitioning our economy away from one that involves oil and gas without any real alternative proposed. Well, one that we have talked about, which has been proposed by folks in the oil and gas sector, is this idea of carbon capture. Now, I am not going to insult you by describing probably poorly the scientific basis of it, but carbon capture is essentially this idea of not ceasing the production of things that result in carbon emissions, but rather finding ways to harness and capture those carbon emissions, and doing so in a way that they still contribute to the overall goal of reducing emissions. So let's talk about this in a bit of context, because there is a little bit of criticism of carbon capture, and some of it was put forward in a recent piece that was co-authored by a gentleman who joins me now, Dr. Kenneth Green, who is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Kenneth, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Good to be with you.
Now, I admit, not being a scientist, I've bought into some of the hype on carbon capture, because it's kind of proposed by conservative politicians, by people in the oil and gas sector, as being this market-friendly way of achieving the government's goals, which, if you accept the goals, or at the very least are not optimistic that those goals are going anywhere, it's a better alternative than, say, just outlawing the industry, which is, I think, where a lot of the activists want. But you're a bit of a skeptic.
Yes, I am. And I'd love to get back to the other topic you were talking about, which is all the environmental measures that are coming on have the same pattern of implementation, that you can actually understand them by looking at how they're implemented rather than what they're supposed to do. But back on carbon capture and storage, I am a skeptic of this. I view it as, and I discuss it as, a fig leaf that's appealing to many, many people. First of all, there is a little grain of truth, a nugget of truth in there, which is oil companies have been using the idea of taking carbon dioxide, re-injecting it into old wells and old fields to push up more oil and gas. They've been doing that. That's carbon storage part. They've been doing that for decades, and it works well. And so there's a small reality there, which is somebody can say, look, they've taken many, many tons of CO2 and put it into the ground, and it stays there, and it's technologically feasible. But it's a fig leaf, because really it's not feasible to capture carbon dioxide emissions from power plants or from agriculture or from any other source, capture them, bind them chemically, store them somewhere underground at any kind of scale that would have any impact at all on global greenhouse gas emissions or air concentrations or warming or anything else. And so, but it's a fig leaf, because governments, as you said, right, when conservative governments get to say, we have an alternative to your socialist net zero 2050 plan, right, which is technology made by good old-fashioned private Canadian companies. Carbon capture and storage is one of those things. So they love it because it's a good fig leaf for them. The industry loves it because they get to say, even though they know they really can't reduce emissions very much anymore by efficiencies, they've plumbed the depths of how efficient they can be, and they're way efficient, right? But they've hit the limits on that. So it's a fig leaf for them to say, we listen, we get it, we hear it. You don't want us emitting carbon dioxide in the air, so we'll do this carbon capture and storage thing. So now let us keep operating. Let us stay in business, right? So they like it. The environmentalist groups like it because it's a fig leaf for them that when they get to a negotiation where companies are saying and have proven that a proposed environmental plan is completely unaffordable and they'll simply have to go out of business, the environmentalists can say, we'll give you this little loophole of you can pretend that carbon capture and storage is going to work and that we're going to actually let you go ahead and do it. So that you can to take away your ability to claim that you're going out of business, but they really never have any intention of allowing the kind of environmental disruption it would take to do carbon capture and storage. So it's sort of a universal fig leaf. Everybody loves it, but nobody believes it's actually going to happen. with good reason, it's never going to happen.
Now, does your skepticism extend to kind of related phenomena like carbon recycling, these other things that we also hear about as being ways to just reduce the carbon in the atmosphere without reducing it at source?
Well, yes. I mean, it's. I wouldn't call it skepticism. It's in this case, it's really simply an understanding of physics, right? Carbon dioxide. The best way to understand carbon dioxide, which you breathe out every time you exhale, is it's a waste gas. That means there's no energy inherent in it. It's a stable chemical that really has no energy inherent in it that you can exploit. So to do anything with it, you have to pump energy in to trap it, to bind it, to split it apart in order to do anything with it. And that means the very idea that you're going to somehow use that to reduce your energy production is silly, right? You're actually going to have to pump more energy in to bind CO2 than to leave it alone. And so, yeah, I'm generally skeptical of anything that claims to be taking CO2 and making anything useful out of it, because it is essentially a planetary waste which has no energy potential for exploiting, is mostly inert. It's chemically inert. And so, yeah, I'm generally dubious, not to say skeptical. I'm scientifically and engineering dubious of those kind of claims.
So what would be a better policy then, if I can just put you on the spot there? Or is it basically challenging the premise that we need to go after it this way in the first place?
Well, I think so. A better policy. That's a big question, Andrew. I hope you got a couple of hours, but a better policy. I think a better policy is moving our focus away from controlling the global thermostat by indirect control of gas emissions we can barely measure well, much less control, that being greenhouse gases and CO2. And we should shift our focus to asking if the climate is warming or cooling or is more variable than we ever thought it was, which we know. How can we make ourselves as societies more adaptive, more resilient, and better able to deal with whatever climate future eventuates, right? It happens to us. And we can do a lot of that with conventional engineering, conventional economics. We don't have to be invoking speculative technologies to do that. Sea level rise, countries, the Netherlands and others have dealt with rising sea levels and sea levels above their land decades and centuries. The Romans dealt with moving massive amounts of water from areas that had water to areas that didn't have water. So we can deal with drought. We can move things around. We can harden areas. California's earthquake damage. I grew up in California. My first earthquake experience, 1969. I was 9 years old. The Silmar earthquake destroyed massive amounts of the San Fernando Valley. By today's standards, an earthquake much stronger than that, hundreds of times stronger than that, would not do anywhere close to the level of damage that was done before, because we learn. Engineering, technology, we do learn. And so we could be addressing the risks of climate change, flooding, drought, heat waves, cold spells, whatever you want to call it, through conventional technology, locally, globally as well. But instead, the world, for reasons can't get into, I'd love to, but for political reasons, has chosen this laser focus on controlling the greenhouse gases and explicitly doing so only through redistribution of wealth. That's the part I would get to on a whole program, which is when you dig down into every program and you can ask, what's the root thing that in this program the government will not do without? It's the component that says we're going to take the money from these people and give it to our constituents who will vote for us, who like our agenda. And so,
well, and just to add to that, that's also baked in even at the global level as well. It's, within countries like Canada, it's redistribution of wealth. And on the global scale, it's redistribution of wealth from Canada to Tuvalu or something.
Well, it has been since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The very first treaty ever signed created the principle that developed countries would go first, and that developed countries would fund the transition for the developing countries by giving being the operative term, technologies and money, massive wealth transfers, in order for them to build out their energy systems and things without producing greenhouse gas emissions. That was actually the central operating principle of the very first climate agreement, and it has stayed the central operating principle of every climate agreement ever since, regardless of the fact that China moved from developing country to developed and is by far the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and will be over time overwhelmingly the world's largest contributor to the increase of greenhouse gases around the world, it's still based. The Paris Accord, the previous UN accords are all based. The central operating principle is redistribution of global wealth.
There is an aspect to this that you touched on a couple of answers ago about the difficulty in even measuring objectively and accurately emissions. And I think also global temperature is one I've seen some criticism about. So, we pin so much on those two metrics, the idea of, global temperature. Right now, we've, got to get to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels is the goal. But measuring global temperature is not as ironclad an objective as the UN likes to say, and nor is the measurement of emissions.
No, and funny you should mention that, but we have a study coming out at the Fraser Institute in the next couple of weeks to a month.
I'm excited.
comparing whether we should be using measurements of the climate or computer models of the climate in order to make our decisions about what policies to implement with regard to climate change. So you can look for that, Fraser Institute, www.fraserinstitute.com. Now they'll love me even more, which is good. And but back to your question, I mean, yes, measurement of climate is a problem. That you can't just stick a thermometer into the atmosphere and wave it around to get the temperature of the Earth any more than you could get the actual temperature of a room you're in. If you think about the room you're in, right, it's warmer toward the ceiling, it's colder toward the floor. Near the air conditioning vents, it's colder still. Over by the window, it's warm. How would you compute just the temperature of your room? Well, it'd be a huge exercise dividing your room into little squares, taking in that temperature at the center of each square, doing a spatial average, and try to do that for the globe. So yes, humility is definitely required in asking the question, can we know the Earth's average temperature of the atmosphere, the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere? On the other hand, the question of can we model it with a computer is even more absurd, right? So it is true that temperature measurements are, I would not want to depend upon them for some sort of industrial process that had to be tightly controlled, like making chips. I wouldn't just say that level of measurement would be good enough for me, but it's better than simply running a computer model that looks like a video game and saying, wow, in this scenario, RCP 8.5, the world gets super hot and zombies take over. Okay, well, yeah, we'll go with that one. So,
and this is what brings us back
imperfect, but better.
The famous hockey stick graph, which I think was it Paul Martin that mailed out a copy to like every Canadian household, and it's been the subject of vociferous debate and even litigation on that. But again, I mean we've seen, to go back to the COVID question, the perils of modeling, which the what you get out of it is no better, and in some cases worse than what you put into it.
And I'm even more glad you mentioned that, because I have a book out called The Plague of Models. That's by me, Kenneth P. Green. You can get it on Google Play. I am proudly censored by Amazon, which is not allowing works on COVID policy that are contrary to get through unless you have divine intervention or the intervention of somebody like Elon Musk in order to get your book approved. But you can get mine on Google Play, The Plague of Models. And basically it talks about exactly this. In the 1970s, here's the thing. In the 1970s, computers got cheap and labs got expensive. And so people started replacing regulators wanted to move really fast on regulations and rules, much faster than they could based on laboratory experiments done in traditional laboratories with scientists working on liquid wet chemistry and biology and things. So models increasingly took over as evidence, but they're not evidence. A model actually takes away information. It doesn't give you more, right? A picture of a supermodel doesn't tell you much about the actual person. A picture of a truck doesn't tell you that much about the actual truck. A picture of Bugs Bunny doesn't tell you anything about the actual behavior of rabbits, right? Those are models. And so when we moved to models and away from research, we took this huge step into speculation, and it's across the board. It's on almost virtually any topic that we now you see a chart or a graph on. Any model that actually projects into the future is inherently modeled, right? Since nobody has a crystal ball. So all of these things saying by 2050, we're going to do this. By 2050, our emissions are going to go like this. By 2050, the temperature is going to go like that. By 2050, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. All of that is completely speculative based on assumptions about the world. There's no data in it. It's right. It's virtually a data-free exercise. And so we have to be very wary of anything based on modeling. As you said, COVID being a case in point. Curiously, as people will notice in my book, people are blaming the wrong models for the problem with COVID. The initial models of how lethal it was were more accurate than you'd think. But the models suggesting that the measures like lockdowns, masks, social distancing, that those things would work, those models were horrible. And those models were relied upon for the governments to say, yeah, we want to do these crackdowns because this model says this will flatten the curve, right? As Trudeau would say, plank the curve. He had to get cutesy with the whole planking thing because, he did that when he first ran for office. Yeah. So the whole plank the curve, flatten the curve thing was based on modeling that said that these measures of masking, distancing, staying at home, closing schools would slow the spread of COVID, even though historically we knew the evidence from all previous infectious diseases in recorded, where there is evidence, we knew those would not work. So that's the COVID scandal part, which again you can read about.
And just, I remember an episode of The West Wing a while ago where, the president was sitting with a couple of economists and asking them for their predictions of what was going to happen. And, one says, we're going to, the economy's going to get better. One says we're going to go to a recession. The third says we're going to hold. And he's like, two of you are going to look very stupid in 6 months' time, which I think is a pretty good way of summing up, how unscientific some of these so-called scientific measures are. Well, it's a fascinating piece and a fascinating topic, and I look forward to the ones that are coming down the pipeline, especially as you've been able to tease some stuff I didn't even know about that's coming up. Dr. Kenneth Green, Senior Fellow with the Fraser Institute. Thank you so much.
A pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.